In 1899, Miami, a young black boy was sold like property, worked until his hands bled, and punished for dreams he was never allowed to have. They called him weak. They called him replaceable. And when he finally disappeared, they assumed he was dead. Another forgotten name swallowed by heat, sugar fields, and salt air. But years later, a stranger arrived in town. He dressed well. He spoke calmly. He carried himself with quiet authority. No one suspected the truth behind his steady eyes. Not the merchants, not the neighbors, and especially not the white master who once owned him. Time had erased the boy's face, but it had not erased his memory. He remembered every order barked in anger, every night spent hungry, every moment of humiliation disguised as discipline. And when fate placed them in the same room again, history bent in a way no one saw coming. The child who had been chained returned as a man with leverage. The master who once commanded everything found himself powerless. What followed wasn't just revenge, it was a haunting reversal of roles that exposed how fragile power truly is. This is the forgotten story of a slave boy who vanished into suffering and came back carrying a past that refused to stay buried. The palmetto bugs scattered across the weathered floorboards as Marcus stepped into the dilapidated mansion on Brickell Avenue. 20 years had passed since he'd last crossed this threshold, but the smell remained the same. Mildew, rotting wood, and something else he couldn't quite name. Memory, perhaps. "You came," croaked a voice from the darkened parlor. Marcus removed his hat, brushing dust from his expensive wool suit. His shoes, polished to a mirror shine, clicked against the floor as he moved toward the sound. In the corner, slumped in a threadbare chair, sat Charles Whitmore. The man who had once towered over Marcus's childhood now seemed impossibly small, his skin hanging loose on his frame, his eyes roomy and unfocused. "I received your letter," Marcus said, his voice measured and calm. He'd spent years cultivating that voice, erasing the accent Whitmore had once mocked. "You said it was urgent," Charles coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "I'm dying." "I can see that. I have no one else." Marcus allowed himself a small, bitter smile. "How the world turns, Mr. Whitmore." The old man's hands trembled as he reached for a glass of water on the table beside him. Marcus watched without moving to help. Let him struggle, he thought. Let him know what it means to need. "I suppose," Charles wheezed, "you've come to gloat." "No," Marcus said, settling into a chair across from him. "I've come because you summoned me. Though I confess, I'm curious why you think I would answer." Charles's laugh turned into another coughing fit. When he recovered, he fixed Marcus with a penetrating stare that briefly recalled the man he'd once been. "Because you're a better man than I ever was, even when you were a boy." Marcus had been 7 years old when his mother died in the quarters behind the main house. The war had been over for 14 years, but freedom was a complicated word in Miami. His mother, Sarah, had stayed on as paid help, though the pay was meager and the freedom questionable. When yellow fever took her, Marcus became, in effect, Charles Whitmore's property once more, though the law said differently. "You'll work for your keep," Charles had told him, shoving the small boy toward the stables. "I took you in out of Christian charity. Don't make me regret it." Christian charity meant 14-hour days, mucking stables, polishing silver, and serving at table, while Charles and his business associates discussed the development of Miami, the extension of the railroad, the money to be made from the wealthy northerners who would soon flood south, seeking warmth and opportunity. At night, Marcus would slip into Charles's library and teach himself to read by candlelight, using the very books that sat unused on Whitmore's shelves. He devoured everything: law, philosophy, mathematics, history. He read about Rome and Greece, about empires that rose and fell. He read about men who had been slaves and became emperors. He read about justice, both divine and earthly. When Charles caught him one night, bent over a volume of Cicero, the beating that followed left Marcus unable to work for 3 days. "Educating yourself, boy," Charles had snarled, his face red with drink and rage. "Think you're too good for honest work? Think you're my equal?" But Marcus continued reading. The beatings came regularly, but so did the knowledge. And with knowledge came understanding. Miami was changing. The railroad was coming. Henry Flagler had grand plans for the settlement that would transform it into a city. There would be opportunities for a clever man who could read and write, who understood figures and the law. On the night of his 17th birthday, Marcus left. Armand somehow walked out of Whitmore's house with nothing but the clothes on his back and the education he'd stolen from Whitmore's own library. He walked north to Jacksonville, where he found work on the docks, saved every penny, and eventually talked his way into an apprenticeship with a black attorney named Samuel Foster. Foster, who had himself been born into slavery, recognized the hunger in Marcus's eyes. "The law," Foster told him, "is our weapon now. Learn to wield it, and no man can keep you in chains again," Marcus learned. He studied harder than anyone Foster had ever taught. He passed the bar examination in 1885, one of the first black attorneys in Florida. And then he began to build. "Tell me," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair, "how did the great Charles Whitmore come to this?" He gestured at the decay surrounding them. Charles's face darkened. "You know how. You engineered it." "I did nothing illegal." "You bought my debts. You foreclosed on my properties. "I used the law," Marcus interrupted, his voice hardening. "The same law that once said I was property, the same law that said you could beat me for trying to educate myself. I learned that law, Mr. Whitmore. I learned it better than you ever did." It had taken Marcus 15 years to build his wealth. He had started small, buying property in the colored section of Jacksonville, then expanding. He'd represented clients that white attorneys wouldn't touch, winning cases through preparation and brilliance rather than connections. He'd invested in businesses, made careful alliances, and slowly, methodically, accumulated power. And all the while, he'd kept track of Charles Whitmore. He'd watched as Whitmore made increasingly poor business decisions, borrowing against properties to fund lavish expenditures. He'd monitored as Miami grew around Whitmore, while the old man clung to outdated ways of thinking, refusing to adapt to the new century approaching. When Whitmore's debts came due in Tarzan 1897, it was Marcus's bank that held them. When Whitmore's properties went to auction, it was Marcus's agents who purchased them. And when Whitmore found himself with nowhere to turn, it was Marcus who offered him a choice: work as a caretaker in this one remaining property, the mansion where Marcus had once served, or face complete destitution. Whitmore had chosen to stay. For 2 years, He'd maintain the house, knowing that he did so at Marcus's pleasure, that Marcus could evict him at any moment. You wanted me to know how it felt, Charles said, to be powerless, to serve. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Outside, he could hear the sounds of the growing city, construction, voices, the whistle of a train in the distance. Miami was becoming everything the men in Whitmore's parlor had once imagined, and Marcus had been part of that growth in ways they never could have anticipated. I wanted you to understand, Marcus said finally, that the accident of birth that made you my master made neither of us better than the other. I wanted you to learn what you never taught me willingly. That power is temporary, that circumstances change, and that how we treat others when we have power defines who we truly are. Charles slumped further in his chair. And have I learned my lesson, Master Marcus? Is that what you want to hear? The word master hung in the air between them, bitter and mocking. Marcus stood, walking to the window. The palmetto trees swayed in the ocean breeze. In the distance, he could see the construction of new hotels, new businesses, the future rising from the coral rock. I received your letter, Marcus said again. You said you were dying and that you had something to tell me. I didn't come here to gloat, Mr. Whitmore. I came because, despite everything, I'm not you. Charles was quiet for so long that Marcus turned to look at him. Tears tracked down the old man's weathered face. Your mother, Charles said, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah. She didn't die of yellow fever. Marcus felt the floor shift beneath him. What? There was no epidemic that year. I told you that too. She was ill, yes, but it was childbed fever. She'd been... Charles stopped, unable to continue. Marcus crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbing the old man by his collar. Speak plainly. I forced myself on her, Charles said, the words stumbling out, and when she became with child, I gave her herbs to end it. But they poisoned her instead. She died because of what I did to her. Your mother died because of me. Marcus's hands shook. He could feel rage building in him like a physical force, threatening to overwhelm the careful control he'd built over decades. He could kill this man. He had the power. Charles was weak, dying, defenseless, just as Marcus had once been. He released Charles's collar and stepped back. Why? Marcus asked, his voice hoarse. Why tell me this now? Because I'm dying and I'm afraid, Charles admitted. I'm afraid of judgment. I'm afraid of hell. I thought if I confessed, if you knew the truth, perhaps you might forgive me. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Forgive you? You want absolution from me? I know I don't deserve it. No, Marcus agreed. You don't. He walked back to the window, his mind reeling. All these years, he'd thought his mother had been another victim of disease, of the fever that periodically swept through Florida. But she'd been murdered, slowly, painfully murdered, by the man who now begged for his mercy. Marcus thought of the law books he'd read, of Cicero and his writings on justice. He thought of Foster telling him that the law was their weapon. But what did the law offer him now? Charles would be dead soon anyway. There would be no real justice, no punishment that could match the crime. I could destroy you, Marcus said quietly. I could make your final days a living hell. I have that power. Yes, Charles whispered. I could expose what you've told me, ensure that whatever legacy you hoped to leave is buried in scandal and shame. Yes, I could beat you as you once beat me. I could deny you medicine, comfort, mercy. Charles said nothing, simply closed his eyes and waited. Marcus stood at that window for a long time, wrestling with himself. The boy he'd been, the one who had cowered under Charles's fists, wanted revenge, wanted to inflict every hurt he'd ever received. But that boy had grown into a man who understood that becoming like Charles Whitmore would be its own kind of slavery. Finally, Marcus spoke. I won't forgive you. What you did is unforgivable, but I won't become you either. He pulled a card from his pocket and placed it on the table. That's the name of a doctor, a good one. He'll come if you call him, and the bill will be sent to me. You'll receive a modest stipend, enough to hire someone to help you and to buy food and medicine. Charles opened, his eyes confused. Why? Because my mother raised me to be better than you, Marcus said. Because Samuel Foster taught me that justice isn't about revenge, and because I refused to let you turn me into the monster you were. He moved toward the door, then paused. This house will remain yours until you die. After that, it will be converted into a school for children who look like I did, who need the education you tried to deny me. Marcus, we're done, Mr. Whitmore. I came because you called, and I've heard your confession. But we're done. Marcus walked out into the bright Miami sunshine. His carriage waited at the street. His driver, a young black man he was putting through law school, standing ready to open the door. Everything all right, sir? The young man asked. Marcus took a deep breath of the salt air, feeling the weight of the past beginning to lift. Yes, Thomas. Everything is as it should be. As the carriage pulled away, Marcus didn't look back at the mansion. He looked forward, toward the city he was helping to build, toward the future that no one could take from him now. Behind him, in the darkness of the decaying house, Charles Whitmore wept, whether from relief, remorse, or the recognition of a mercy he didn't deserve. Even he couldn't say. The Marcus Washington School for Colored Children stood on Brickell Avenue, a handsome brick building with bright windows and a well-tended lawn. Inside, 300 students learned reading, writing, mathematics, and law. On the wall of the main hall hung a portrait of Marcus Washington himself, now gray-haired and distinguished, a successful attorney and businessman who had helped shape the city of Miami. And in a smaller frame beside it was a photograph of a young black woman, her eyes kind and her smile gentle. Sarah Washington, mother of Marcus, whose memory was honored by every child who walked through those doors into a future she had not lived to see, but which her son had fought to create. The old Whitmore mansion had been completely transformed, but if you looked closely in the cornerstone of the building, you could still see the date it had been laid, 1900, the year Charles Whitmore died, alone in a rented room, his modest funeral paid for by the man whose life he had tried to break. Justice, Marcus had learned, was not about revenge. It was about ensuring that the chains of the past did not bind the future. It was about using power not to dominate, but to liberate. And it was about proving, day after day, that the content of one's character mattered infinitely more than the circumstances of one's birth. In that, Marcus Washington had succeeded beyond measure.